Speculation continues to grow that Belarus will commit troops to Russia's war against Ukraine. The country has already allowed Moscow to use it as a military base and place its weapons there. The Belarusian leader, Alexander Lukashenko, has said the country would not get involved in any military action, but he might not have a choice.
Two leaders demonstrating how close they have become. Russia's Vladimir Putin usually keeps his guests at more than arm's length, but not this one. Belarus's Alexander Lukashenko has become essential to his military operation, even before he invaded Ukraine. At the beginning of February, the two countries held joint military exercises. The drills were a show of strength and more proof to the outside world that Belarus had become a Russian satellite. After Russia invaded Ukraine, Belarus even changed its constitution to reverse its non-nuclear status. That means all Russian weapons, including nuclear, are allowed on Belarusian soil. But Lukashenko has so far refused to commit his forces to aid Putin's war.
We are not going to get involved in the operation that Russia is conducting in Ukraine. Most importantly, I'm telling you, as a military serviceman, there is no need for it.
That surprised many. But there doesn't appear to be the appetite for Russia's war, even among former soldiers who've left Belarus and are now fighting with Ukrainian forces. At only 45,000 active members, the Belarusian army is tiny compared to Russia's. It appears, though, that Moscow needs reinforcements after losing an estimated 6,000 troops since its invasion of Ukraine. Russia is already using Belarus as a military base for its war. To have access to its army as well could help Moscow in its campaign against the Ukrainian capital Kyiv and the city of Lviv. Belarus may be resisting such a move, but if Putin decides he needs even more from his neighbour, Lukashenko will find it hard to say no.
I'd like to welcome now Svetlana Titianovskaya, the Belarusian opposition leader and human rights activist. She is joining us from the Lithuanian capital, Vilnius. Ms. Titianovskaya, good to have you with us. We heard Alexander Lukashenko clearly say there that Belarus will not directly engage in any military action against Ukraine. Do you believe him? Ms. Titianovskaya, can you hear us?
Yeah, now I can. Look, we have to say that Belarus is already involved in the war from the very first day when Lukashenko allowed Russian troops to use our territory to bomb Ukraine. So de facto, Belarus is already involved, and Belarus is the co-aggressor of this war. However, there is a huge opposition to war among ordinary Belarusians, among supporters of changes, and even the military. As we know, that Belarusian army refuses to go to Ukraine despite pressure and threats. 2 weeks ago, Belarusian army was already supposed to join Russian troops, but something went wrong. And since the very day of this war, we have been working with officers, with arms of soldiers, explaining why Belarus shouldn't be involved in this war with Ukraine. And we also explain what to do in case if soldiers will be forced to cross the border, how to surrender the Ukrainian military. And I really don't know if invasion of Belarusian troops happens, but all the Belarusians, free Belarusians, doing everything possible to prevent it.
So you're saying that there is an active resistance among Belarusians against this war in Ukraine, is that right?
Yes, that's true.
What will that mean for President Lukashenko then, because he indeed will be under a lot of pressure from Vladimir Putin?
So there is always a choice to participate in this war and betray Belarusian land, to betray Belarusian people, to act not in the interests of our country, or to serve to Kremlin and be accomplice of this war. And I understand that illegitimate Lukashenko is under huge pressure at the moment, but what I know else is that Belarusian people, Belarusian military officers are also resistant to supposedly criminal order.
You've also said that Belarus is essentially under de facto occupation. Belarus has been called a satellite state of Russia at this point. So again, how much choice do you think the leadership, Alexander Lukashenko, actually does have in the face of the Kremlin?
Yeah, I think that it wouldn't be exaggeration to say that Belarus is under de facto double occupation, Lukashenko's regime and Putin troops. And but again, it's all about choice. You want to protect your country from becoming pariah like Russia at the moment, or to start communicating with free Belarusian people and save our country from Iron Curtain, from economic collapse, and to start to communicate, to have dialogue with the people about the situation.
You have said that the fates of Belarus and Ukraine, they are interconnected. What did you mean by that?
I mean that without free Ukraine, there will be no free Belarus, for sure, because in the case Ukraine fails in this war, I don't believe in this. I'm sure that Ukraine will win, but just in the case Lukashenko will feel rather strong because he is allied to winner, and all our political prisoners will be in prison for many, many years. Of course, our movement will not give up even in this case, but our main task is to help Ukraine, to help Ukrainians to win, because it will give us a very important chance to get rid of Lukashenko's regime in our country.
How can the Belarusian people and indeed the military who you mentioned help Ukrainians right now and help stop this war? So since the very beginning of the war, we launched anti-war movement in Belarus. This movement includes partisans attacks, like cyber partisans hack the state institutions, disrupt the movement of Russian troops on our territory. Our railway partisans disrupted the railway connection between Belarus and Ukraine, and this was confirmed by the head of the Ukrainian railways. More than 15 diversions on the railways did take place. Also, we explaining people what's going on in reality, because after crackdown of our movement in 2020, all the free media have been ruined in Belarus, but they managed to revive the activity in exile, and now it's our task to explain Belarusian people real situation. State propaganda is working very hard, and they repeat Russian narrative about this war. And also we disrupt leaflets, self-made newspapers among cyber population, to open the eyes for people. And it's very important. And of course, we can't stop this war immediately, but only our joint actions, our joint position will help us to move closer to the victory. Ms. Titianovskaya, one more question for you. I do want to ask you about what you think of the 9-year jail sentence that's been handed down to Russian opposition figure Alexei Navalny today.
This sentence is a personal revenge of Mr. Putin, because Navalny was a powerful voice of people. He spoke about corruption and showed Russians the alternative. It's the same as with my husband, who was sentenced to 18 years in jail. And now when Russian society lives in this propagandistic pro-war narrative, Navalny's voice would be too dangerous for Kremlin, of course. And Alexei Navalny demonstrated real bravery when decided to come back to Russia, knowing that he can be imprisoned. And for many Russians and for Belarusians, of course, he is a true freedom fighter.
We'll have to leave it there. Svetlana Titianovskaya, Belarusian opposition leader, human rights activist. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
We can get some more perspective on the story now with Jurg Forsberg. He is the director for Central and Eastern Europe at the German Marshall Fund of the United States here in Berlin. Good to have you with us. Is there at this point any evidence that we could see Belarus join Russia's war against Ukraine?
Yes, absolutely. Basically, what we see are preparations in the Belarusian military to, if needed and so ordered by the Kremlin, join the Russian war against Ukraine. The country has readied about 11 battalion tactical groups in the south of Belarus, so near the border with Ukraine. 5 of these are mechanized, 5 of these, or 6, are somewhat more elite assault units, and then there is a Spetsnaz brigade. So there are troops that have been readied by Belarus, that have been stationed in the south of the country, and that amount to about 10% of the Russian military engaged already in Ukraine. So this is non-negligible.
That would indicate that Russia is essentially using Belarus, as we said earlier, as a military post. So, I mean, how much influence does the Russian president have over Belarus?
Well, I think first we need to acknowledge that Belarus is already engaged in this war. It basically lends its territory to Russia as a military staging ground. It lends its infrastructure, rail and road. There are at least 2 airfields that are being used for rocket attacks on Ukraine. There are the hospitals that are basically full with Russian casualties. So Belarus is already fully engaged here. But of course, it is a step away still from a direct engagement militarily and invading the neighboring country. And this is really something that's not in the hands of the Lukashenko regime anymore. Lukashenko is basically a vassal to Putin. He's, for the last 2 years at least, he is politically fully dependent on Moscow, because otherwise he couldn't have restabilized his power after the protests that we saw in 2020. He is economically dependent on Russia, on energy, on finances. He's also in the same boat with Russia when it comes to Western sanctions and the political isolation. So there is very little agency that Lukashenko has left. He's basically occupied his own country politically. He's an illegitimate ruler, and he allowed Russia to also basically militarily occupy his country. So there's very little he can do if Russia orders him to join the invasion of Ukraine.
And just one last question. If they do take that next step of direct engagement, as you said, what direction would the war then go? What impact could that have?
Well, I think the assessment of the Belarusian military is that it is not particularly motivated, it's not particularly operational, so this will not be a boost to Russia's war in Ukraine. If anything, it will also be hampered by very difficult terrain, because the borderlands between Ukraine and Belarus are very marshy. They're very hard to operate in for a military. So I don't think this will be a boost in military terms. But what it will do, of course, is first, it will lead to also a full responsibility for the Lukashenko regime for the war and war crimes in Ukraine.
Right.
And it will certainly also permanently sour social relationships between Belarusian and Ukrainian societies.
Okay. Jurg Forsberg, Director for Central and Eastern Europe at the German Marshall Fund. Thanks so much for sharing your analysis with us today.
Thank you.